توالت الآراء ووجهات النظر الرامية إلى قرب سقوط حكومة الرئيس السوري بشار الأسد، ولكنها لم تسقط، إلا أن الجهود حثيثة للمزيد من التقسيم والشرذمة. النزال والهزيمة والانتصار في مدينة القصير وتداعياته على سوريا والساحة الإقليمية من وجهة نظر أمريكية من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا.
ولك احلى اشبال الاسد، يلا بسرعه.
على الاسد ان يرحل، على الاسد ان يتنحى. نظام الاسد بدأ يتلاشى وسيسقط. تحليلات ونداءات وبيانات سقطت وتلاشت ورحلت بسقوط المجموعات المسلحة في القصير وأخواتها. فبعد 2.5 عام على بدء الصراع في سوريا، يبقى الأسد متربعاً في عرينه ومملكته. فالمظاهرات التي بدأت في آذار مارس 2011 ما فتئت أن تحولت إلى ما يروج له أنه عصيان داخلي، إلا أنه من الجلي أن أدواته وسعيره وتمويله وعديده خارجية وبامتياز. الأسد تنبأ أن الدبلوماسية ستفشل، وأن مناهضيه في داخل سوريا وخارجها منقسمون إلى حد عدم اتفاقهم على أي إطار سلام، ويبدو أنه مصيب في تلميحه إلى أرجحية تدخل خارجي أكثر وأكبر. البروفيسور في كلية الشؤون الدولية في جامعة بنسلفانيا في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، والمحلل السابق لدى وكالة الاستخبارات المركزية CIA، والمدير السابق لشؤون الشرق الأوسط في إدارة مجلس الامن القومي خلال ولاية بوش، فلينت ليفيريت، كيف يرى الأزمة السورية اليوم؟ وهل أصبح الوحل السوري أكثر عمقاً وخطورة من ذاك الذي ما فتئنا نشهده في العراق؟ Professor Flint Leverett, former CIA analyst and National Security Council Middle East staffer expert, welcome back to the Inside, sir. Well, actually, back in November 2011, King Abdullah of Jordan said that the chances of Assad surviving were so slim and that he ought to step down. And after 1 year also, NATO Secretary General Mr. Rasmussen also said, quote, "I think the regime in Damascus is approaching collapse." Yet the regime did not collapse. It is strong. The Assad government is still so strong, particularly after the battle of Qusayr. Why do you think so?
You know, we've been through this before. After former Lebanese Prime Minister Hariri was assassinated in 2005, many people in Washington thought that this would be the beginning of the end of the Assad regime. They were wrong then. And we're going through a more extreme version of this now in Washington, but it's still wrong. And it's wrong for a couple of reasons. One, President Assad and his government retain, and this is borne out by polling data, by other evidence, they retain the support of significant parts of Syrian society. You know, I would estimate that at least half of Syrian society continues to support the Assad government.
Even more, according
and
to
I think
the
that
recent
probably
polls.
is increasing, that's right. On the other hand, there is no hard evidence, no polls, any other data, that anywhere close to a majority of Syrians supports, let's call it the opposition. I mean, clearly there are people who are disaffected, Syrians who are disaffected from their government, Syrians who feel like they have legitimate grievances, either against the government or that the government is not addressing.
The government also admitted that.
That's
and
right.
They admitted also at the beginning of what they termed as a revolution in Syria that they committed some mistakes.
Yes, yes. And I think there are serious political problems in Syria, but there's no evidence that a majority of Syrians wants to get rid of the Assad government, and I think that's a very important base of support for the government. The other thing that I think is at play here, and Hillary and I have been arguing this for a long time, that it is a delusion for the United States, for other Western countries, to think that if somehow you were able to bring down the Assad government, that what replaces it is some secular liberal democracy that wants to be aligned in its foreign policy with the West. That's an absolute fantasy that has nothing to do with reality. I mean, what you see, I think, is that if the Assad government were somehow to disappear, what would replace it would be a group of very contentious, not unified,
extreme,
and in many cases, you know, some people in the West like to say jihadi. I think I'd prefer the term takfiri, Islamist, you know, Jabhat al-Nusra, other groups that seem to have a lot in common with Al-Qaeda. You know, and the kind of Syria that emerges after the Assad government disappears is, I mean, I don't think it's going to be very good for Syrians. I don't think it would be very good for American interests in the Middle East. But what really drives, what's driving American policy towards Syria right now, and I think it's important to say this honestly, the things that are driving American policy towards Syria now are, first of all, a sense that if you could bring down the Assad government, it's this big blow to Iran. Iran is a huge driver for the Obama administration in Syria. And secondly, there's an interest in co-opting the Arab awakening. You know, when the Arab awakening started, you had pro-Western regimes in Tunisia, in Egypt, fall. You had a near miss in Bahrain. And so the Obama administration in early 2011 is looking around. It wants to find a way to show that it's not just authoritarian regimes that subordinate their foreign policies to the United States that are at risk in the Arab awakening. The Arab awakening could also take down a government, a political order that has a clear commitment to foreign policy independence, and Syria was the case for doing that, and they thought they could use the opposition to do this. This project has failed.
How do you describe the situation in Syria so far, since the start of the events back in March 2011?
I think at times it's approached an outright civil war. You've had from very early on lots of outside support coming in, so that what, you know, might have been in some respects an indigenously generated protest against, you know, particular grievances soon became this violent campaign to try and overthrow the Assad government. It became, in a way, a civil war. And, you know, as long as weapons, money is coming in from the outside, the opposition they were able to, you know, prompt a lot of fighting, prompt a lot of damage, a lot of deaths.
Are we going to see such kind of consequences also flowing into Lebanon or other parts, maybe Iraq also, maybe Jordan?
I certainly hope not. There is that risk. You know, if you look at it historically, when we've had these kinds of civil wars, these kinds of internal battles in Middle Eastern societies, historically, the region has been able to contain it. You know, there was a very bloody civil war here in Lebanon for 15 years, and it didn't really spill over into other countries. What happened in Iraq after the U.S. invaded in 2003? That didn't really spill over into other countries. What happened in Algeria didn't
However,
really spill over.
Flint, nowadays in Syria, for example, particularly let's take the example of Qusayr, where you have a very important Lebanese actor, which is Hezbollah. They took part in the battle
right.
and the conflict in Qusayr. What would be the implications of this and the consequences of such an outcome, whether it's a success or a failure to one side or to the other, not only on Syria, but on the whole region, Lebanon, Israel?
In Washington, the narrative is that it is Iran and Hezbollah that have made this a sectarian struggle. I think the reality is just the reverse. It is the Saudis, it is other external supporters of the opposition who have really wanted to make this a battle against an infidel regime, you know, a Shia regime. And then when Hezbollah, when Iran are helping the Assad government, then that becomes, you know, this becomes a sectarian battle. I think it really is, from an Iranian perspective, from what I understand of the Hezbollah perspective, this is really, it's an effort to resist a campaign sponsored in part by the United States, sponsored in part by Saudi Arabia, sponsored by others, but a campaign to use the Syrian opposition to bring about regime change in Syria and tilt the balance of power in the region. And it's also an effort to preserve a position of resistance against US and Israeli hegemony in the region. And those were the motives for Iranian and Hezbollah support for the Assad government, as I understand it. And, you know, I think in the end, resistance will overcome sectarianism.
But you know, Hezbollah was always, it was born, its inception was there as in a state of being in defense.
That's right.
Okay, but now it moved way into an attack phase. Why this shift in its politics?
I think it's because of the situation. I mean, even in the, yes, Hezbollah was born in resistance to an Israeli invasion and occupation of Lebanon. But even then, the goal was ultimately to end the occupation, to make the Israelis leave Lebanon, and Hezbollah finally succeeded at that. In some ways, you know, the situation is tactically different, but I think strategically the same dynamic applies. You've had a kind of foreign invasion of Syria.
Yes, they say in Qusayr it was a global war.
It was certainly, you know, this is part of what's so sad about the Syrian situation, that you took what might have been some elements of legitimate grievance, legitimate protest internally, and you just overlaid this external invasion on top of it. And so, you know, in the end, the Assad government is fighting for Syrian sovereignty. The supporters of the Assad government, whether it's Iran or Hezbollah, they are fighting to prevent, in a sense, a foreign occupation of Syria. Now, tactically, yes, Hezbollah and others did things in Qusayr that you wouldn't have to do, say, in the 1980s or 1990s while you're resisting the Israeli occupation. But I think in a strategic sense, the agenda is the same. And I think if you look at what actually wins in this region, resistance wins. Sectarianism doesn't win, resistance wins.
Dr. Leveret, we're going to stop now for a short break, and then when we come back, we'll talk a bit about the Israeli stance when it comes to the conflict that took place in Qusayr and the consequences and the outcome of this conflict. The Insight will be back after the break. Don't go away. كتب المحلل السياسي في صحيفة يدعوت أحرنوت الإسرائيلية اليومية
أليكس فيشمان في 6 من حزيران يونيو عام 2013: لا يمكن تجاهل حقيقة أن الفشل في القصير هو وصمة أخرى في السياسة المترددة والواهنة للأمريكيين في المسألة السورية، فإذعان الإدارة الأمريكية لروسيا خلال الأسابيع الأخيرة حول مؤتمر جنيف 2 لحل مشكلة سوريا له دور كبير في سقوط القصير. المحلل السابق لدى وكالة الاستخبارات المركزية السي فلينت ليفيريت كيف يقرأ هذا اللوم الإسرائيلي للأمريكيين بشأن سبب سقوط القصير، وهل حقيقة باعت أمريكا المجموعات المسلحة لروسيا؟
I think the Israelis are stuck. They have a national security strategy that rests upon Israel's ability to use force first, to use it whenever, wherever it wants, in whatever measure Israeli leaders think is useful, and for pretty much whatever purpose Israeli leaders want to pursue. They need a kind of nearly absolute freedom of unilateral military initiative to do that. Mm-hmm. And the reason why Hezbollah is such a problem for Israel is because it is proven to be a meaningful constraint on Israel's ability to do this. To some degree, Hezbollah has been an effective and meaningful constraint. And so from the beginning of the conflict in Syria, I think Israel in its dealings with the United States has been kind of conflicted. On the one hand, they didn't want the United States to push so hard for the Assad government's overthrow that it produced this kind of failed state scenario with Jabhat al-Nusra and other groups like that right on Israel's border. But on the other hand, they thought, well, maybe this is an opportunity where we could find ways to weaken Hezbollah, weaken Iran's position in the region by damaging the Assad government. Well, this was a game that has failed. And if anything, Hezbollah, Iran, the Assad government, their position is going to be stronger coming out of this. And it's not the first time that the Israelis would be, blaming the United States for, in a sense, not having achieved the impossible. Mm-hmm. Even in Egypt, when Mubarak fell, the Israelis were stunned that the United States didn't do more to keep Mubarak in power, and thought this was a major failing on the part of the Obama administration. Now, realistically, there was no meaningful way, I think, that the United States could have kept Mubarak in office. This was a failed project from the beginning, but the loss of this subordinate partner in Egypt was such a problem for the Israelis. There is criticism of the way the Obama administration had handled the Egyptian situation. Now there's criticism of the way
yes, because there
Syria.
are those interventionists who are just pushing the Obama administration into trying to go and intervene in the Syrian conflict, yet he's refusing so far. He didn't take such a step. And you have also, according to the recent poll, 68% of the Americans, they oppose any intervention, any military intervention in Syria. Maybe they are intervening, but not militarily.
Obama is, in a way, he's drawn the line that, at least so far, he doesn't want America to become directly involved. He also wants to preserve this fiction that the United States is not directly giving weapons to the opposition, even though the United States is helping others figure out to whom to give weapons in the opposition. The United States is helping to train the Syrian opposition in using those weapons.
It's very paradoxical and confusing here. You brand al-Nusra as a terrorist organization, but then you try to infiltrate arms to certain people who would drive them to al-Nusra, and it's a vicious circle.
I mean, ultimately, Obama doesn't have a real strategy. He's trying to balance some impulses, some imperatives, some domestic political pressures, and so it leads him to do some very, very foolish things. Like even before King Abdullah of Jordan or before the NATO Secretary General say that Assad is going to go, President Obama comes out in, I think it's July or August of 2011,
and he
nearly
said
2 years ago, said Assad has to go.
Yes.
And he's put himself in this unnecessarily in this foolish position where he now, in order to recover the American position, he's going to have to find some way to walk back from that. He said from the beginning that any kind of political process, you know, Iran couldn't participate. Iran could have no constructive role in this. Well, if you're going to have a process, you need all of the relevant players there, and that means you need Iran there. And the Obama administration is going to have to find a way to walk back.
So what are the major obstacles for the Geneva II conference to materialize?
3 things. American insistence that Assad has to go. It's not just a kind of precondition for a process, it's almost, you call it pre-result for a process. Secondly, American hostility to the idea of Iran participating in the process. I think that's an obstacle. And then third, American unwillingness to talk in a serious way to the opposition and to other supporters of the opposition that this project of using the opposition to bring down the Assad government has failed. It's time to get serious about diplomacy aimed at a political settlement. And you know that means the flow of weapons to the opposition needs to stop. Those are the 3 main obstacles. There are 3 positions that the Obama administration has taken, and in order to find a more constructive path in Syria, the United States is going to have to find ways to walk back from those 3 things.
Now, according to some analysts at the Wilson Center, they say if Geneva II fails, the U.S. will be drawn in probably along the lines of providing some lethal assistance to the armed groups.
I think there will be a lot of pressure on President Obama, particularly from Republicans, to do more. You know, there'll be calls for no-fly zones, for direct military involvement. I suspect President Obama will be very reluctant to do that. But his way of trying to appease these forces who want him to do more will be to step up assistance to the Syrian opposition. And we may well drop this, I think it's a fiction now, that we're not providing lethal aid.
You concluded one of your most recent articles actually by saying, quote, President Obama has made egregious blunders in his policy towards Syria since March 2011. Let's hope he doesn't compound them by listening to John McCain and others desperate to hold on to delusions of American empire in the Middle East.
Yes. At the risk of seeming immodest, I think it was a good sentence.
Yeah, sure. Now, let me just here talk a bit about the editor-in-chief of today's Zaman, which is a leading Turkish newspaper, very close to the government and to the Turkish leadership, actually. And he talked about a greater Sunni state, a new Middle East based on the breakup of Syria and Iraq along sectarian lines and the creation of a Kurdish nation. So how do you read this?
I think that if you look,
this is the new Middle East.
That's right. And I think if you look at before the Arab awakening, my wife and I thought that Turkish policy in the Middle East under Erdogan, under the AKP, was actually in a lot of ways very, very smart and very constructive. And then when the Arab awakening began, it's like all of the rationality, all of the intelligence that had been in Turkish policy seemed to go out the window. And I think that Prime Minister Erdogan and his associates, that they did get wrapped up with this idea that you were going to have this kind of Sunni resurgence in the region, and you were going to be able to remake the Middle East. You were going to be breaking up multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian states along sectarian lines, and that in the end, Turkey could increase its influence more by playing that game than by doing what it had been doing before, which was a real zero problems with neighbors policy. Turks will decide for themselves what's in their interest, but I have to say, as an outsider, I think that Erdogan and his colleagues made enormous mistakes.
Are we seeing the repercussions of such mistakes nowadays in Turkey?
It would seem that that's at least part of what is driving the protests and the unrest that we're seeing in Turkey.
Now, what will a Turkish-Israeli reconciliation mean to Syria? And not just a Turkish-Israeli, but also a Turkish PKK reconciliation to a certain extent.
I think for the Turks, if they are anticipating more of an interventionist role in Syria than they're already playing, that it would be important for them to rectify whatever disagreements they have with Israel, to make sure that if, for example, Turkish troops were ever to intervene in Syria, that there's no problem with Israel, that Israel is on board, Israel knows what's going on, and is going to be comfortable with what Turkey is doing. I think that's also ultimately, to the extent that there is a reconciliation with the PKK, there's a calculation that if you're going to go through this exercise of trying to redraw boundary lines in the Middle East, for Turkey, you need to have some solution to Turkey's own Kurdish issue at hand, because otherwise, why are you not redrawing Turkey's boundaries along with Iraq's boundaries and Syria's boundaries? So I think that's, those are important parts of the motives for Turkish moves.
One last question, if I may ask, please. What do you see coming next to President Bashar al-Assad and his government?
I assume that the government will try and build on the kinds of military gains it's had recently at Qusayr and other places. People are talking about an offensive to retake Aleppo. I think that the Syrian government would remain open to a serious political process, serious in the sense that the opposition isn't demanding everything that it wants up front before it even has to negotiate anything. I think the Syrian government will remain open to that. But in the meantime, I think the Syrian government will build on the military gains it's had recently.
It's achieving, yes. Professor Flynt Leverett, former CIA analyst and National Security Council Middle East staffer expert, many thanks indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Again, yes, you're most welcome, sir. إذن لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@almayadeen.net. إذن theinside@almayadeen.net. من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين، السلام عليكم.